But yeah, I just wanted to kind of like inform you and your audience a little bit because for the audience, sorry, Rose asked me to introduce myself and I failed. I work in commercial banking here in the United States, so not Canada. I'm in Seattle though, so I'm close to Canada. And usually with all the Twitch politics, etc., I'm mostly a lurker and I just watch while I'm doing work or something like that because it's entertaining, informative, etc. But with the economic measures order that Canada is imposing, I saw that this kind of entered my little area of expertise, and that a lot of the analysis was kind of missing some aspects of the situation that the financial industry could help illuminate. So I asked Rose if I could like come on and kind of explain some of those aspects a little bit, and here I am. And then, Rose, I sent you both those links. Were you able to get them up there?
Yep, I have them opened right now. And for my knowledge, the main reason is that what we're going to be discussing mainly is specifically the financial freezing aspects of the Emergency Act and to what extent it allows you to do stuff and what it allows you to do. So just basically more information, more detailed analysis on that. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Because admittedly, I am a Bosch fan, so I am coming at this from the bias of being like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But essentially, the core act in and of itself, the Emergency Powers Act, I'm not saying I don't necessarily have problems with it, but what I am saying is that it's not that shocking. It is a very boilerplate of emergency powers for like Western democracies type of thing of further restrictions on protesting, greater power to federal government and policing, etc. So there's nothing really too crazy there in the core act, both in the what's written in the law that was written in 1985, passed in 1988, and also the actual public order disruption. But with the public order emergency came an addendum, which is the economic measures order. So we're going to get to that last, though, because that's where most of our problem comes in. Mm-hmm. I want to give a brief summary of kind of like the history of financial regulation and what building blocks that this economic measures order, emergency economic measures order, is built on top of.
Okay. And just so you know, so I have the document open now on my end. If you want me to bring attention to any specific thing, just tell me what page and like what paragraph, and I'll go and zoom on the respective bit.
Perfect. So yes, essentially, the Emergencies Act of 1985, link there, we can mostly ignore that. I put a few notes there on kind of what it outlines that kind of pertain to today, specifically the public order emergency. The 1988 Act outlines 3 different emergencies that you can declare, and public order is the one that the Canadian government chose, which is probably the most apt since it's protests. And then powers granted to the state, restrictions imposed to the state. One of the interesting restrictions that if you want to open it up and scroll down to 20 subsection 2 if you want, is that it negates the government's ability to take control of local police forces. Essentially, and this is, Bosch would describe this as states' rights. In this sense, I think it's a good thing. It keeps the autonomy of the provinces pretty solid. Like, it's not like this act makes it so that the federal Canadian government can take complete control of every municipality's police, every province's equivalent of our American National Guard, etc. Really, they're still limited to only federal agencies, with the exception of the Royal Mounted Police Corps. in jurisdictions where there's not some kind of special agreement with that province. So that's what I mean when I say the act itself isn't really that scary. In the powers that it grants, like, it's not tyrannical in our colloquial sense of the word.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you were an anarchist, every action of state power is tyrannical.
Mm-hmm.
But comparatively to most Western democracies, this is not crazy at all.
Okay, so just so I summarize what you just said, just to make sure I'm on the same page. So one of the major restrictions on the Emergencies Act is that it gives the federal authorities more power to act and kind of like broadens their range, so to say, but it doesn't actually give them control to seize any of the local or take control of any of the other like municipal departments or whatever. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And also when they invoke it, they have to, so the prime minister and his council has to check in with the provincial ministers before invoking it, which they did. And one other restriction is if it's invoked across like one province, like let's say the French Canadians are finally rising up, they're rebelling, and it's invoked for Quebec, then the powers are limited only to Quebec. But for this today's order of emergency, it was invoked nationwide since the protests are somewhat widespread.
Okay, that's interesting because I don't know if it's like, hey, we can only do it for one specific area, because I think when it went into passing, Trudeau said that, hey, this is going to be used like in a geographically limited capacity. Yet it seems like when it was passed, and that's something I pointed out a little bit earlier, there are no restrictions for exactly where it could be passed. So we're kind of like taking the word that, okay, it's just going to be used in this area. Is that something you know about? Is it possible for it to have been invoked in a specific, more like geographically localized capacity? Or is it at the state right now where the 2 or 3 areas where they might need to invoke it are so spread out that it's not possible to specialize it, and at that point you just kind of have to do the whole country? Or do you know about that?
I think in my reading of the original legislation from 1988, essentially it was stating those limitations apply if you're only invoking it in one province, so to speak.
Okay.
Since I think they're invoking it in like handling things in like 3 different provinces, then it doesn't really apply.
So
but
they had to do it nationally.
Yeah. In the case where you are going to do that limited rollout, they would actually state so in the declaration of the emergency, which they do not state in today's declaration of emergency. So that's why it's kind of like nationwide. But essentially, there would be a little section saying, like, outlining the province/region that it's for, so to speak. And then our next document is just the Declaration of Public Order of Emergency. This is just what the Act requires in order to create an emergency. And it's all standard boilerplate copy of what the Act says mostly. The one interesting bit is Subsection C of the temporary measures. This is the section where the Canadian government will kind of say, hey, we have this emergency, and here's what we think we need, the powers that we think we need to solve that emergency. And they'll outline those powers. Section C is specific to the economic powers there.
Where is this page?
So that's in that second document there, the Declaration of Public Order Emergency, SOR /2022 Tech 20.
Okay, this one, yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, okay, so it was this one.
Yeah.
And you're reading from?
Yeah, so you can go down to the second Section C.
Okay.
So it's like, we do specify the emergency, not that. Instead, you're going to go to, we do further specify that special temporary measures may be necessary for dealing with the emergency. And these are the subsections. So subsection C, where it says measures to authorize, direct.
Got it.
Any person, yeah, all that jazz. And this is where things kind of get interesting, because the original 1988 Act actually doesn't have a whole lot of financial language written into it. There's a little bit about like prohibiting certain use of property, but there's not a whole lot. And so this is kind of where we first get our indication. And then we have our emergency measures regulations, which just defines what you're not supposed to do. Essentially, it's just don't go to the protest, don't facilitate the protest, don't help the protests, in sections 2 through 5 there. And then we have the Emergency Economic Measures Order, which is where most of our problem comes in. Now, when this news first broke, and I saw Vosh's rather hilarious, heated stream after his Twitter confrontations. I wanted to kind of like look into the specifics of this, since I work in the financial services industry, and part of working is, at least in the United States and most Western countries, part of working in that industry is you're doing yearly trainings on 20 to 30 different regulations, and it takes probably like a couple weeks of your time every year. So I was like, okay, well, how does this like add up? And I knew that normal media publications would absolutely fail like if you meet the details, which is why I actually have all the actual legislation text here. But I also wanted to kind of like take a look at what the industry was saying. So we have down below here, at the bottom of that first page, is a couple of attorneys' offices that did a breakdown for financial services providers, kind of explaining like, hey, here's what you can expect. And then also a breakdown / commentary from an insurance industry publication, talking about how this will affect the insurance industry, how they should address it, etc. Right now in the financial services industry, there seems to be a lot of uncertainty in how this will be rolled out, largely due to the vagueness of the text and the Emergency Economic Measures Order. But the consensus is, and after reading through both Canada's terrorism laws as well as the Economic Measures Order, the consensus is basically these are kind of like built off of the foundation of how Canada addresses money laundering and terrorism finance already. So I just kind of wanted to like build up our base a little bit to like give the audience and yourself a little bit of understanding of how the financial services sector approaches terrorism financing, money laundering, criminal activities, funds, etc., so that we can then go from there to look at this economic order measure that's kind of based off of that idea.
Okay.
And then, did you have any questions so far, or anything like that?
Yeah. So far, my understanding then is that what this is effectively doing is it's enveloping, or it's kind of like broadening the way that Canada handles terrorist funding, and it's kind of handling, whatever situation it's declaring an emergency order for, it's handling that situation the same way it would handle terrorist funding when it comes to the legal capacity for the for the government to step in and provide limitations and stuff like that. Have I understood that correctly?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Excellent.
Yes, very much so. So I kind of have notes here. So our first thing to do is to kind of like take a look at terrorism, how it's defined in Canada, because one of the funnest things in my opinion about a term like terrorism is you can
define it any way you want.
Yeah, exactly. Like I saw Heemed calling this economic terrorism, and I'm like, yeah, you can make that argument, and I mean I'd agree with that, but also with the laws that are written by Western democracies regarding terrorism, if you start having a broad definition of terrorism, those laws become extremely dangerous for civil liberties. Like we're talking about the USA Patriot Act, specifically, where lots of bad stuff occurred. And the whole justification for a whole lot of removal of civil rights, of fair trial, of an access to attorney, was because, oh, well, they're a terrorist. And that's bad in and of itself, because everyone should have those rights. But when you then broaden the definition of terrorist to include anywhere from 5 to 20% of your country, then you're in very dangerous waters. especially with that legislation that's already been passed, because basically now, if you expand your definition, all that old legislation
Yeah, it
applies.
comes into effect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, Canadian terrorism basically is our colloquial understanding of, for the purposes of a political ideology, and also with the intent to gain political favor and the intent to cause harm, death, or maimings of people, specifically unrelated people. So what Canada does not define in their legal definition of terrorism, economic terrorism is not in there. Eco-terrorism, like
spiking trees,
cracking open a gas pipe or something, I don't know, is not in there. Like if you're doing actual violence to someone for the eco-terrorism, then yeah, it's in there.
Mm-hmm.
But the key is like actual violence.
Okay. Violence against person and not against property.
Yes, violence against people, and specifically either political figures or unrelated, anyone that happens to be around.
Okay, because here I'm seeing something on the terrorist bit, terrorism in Canadian Criminal Code, Part B, 3, D, and E. No, sorry, B2, D and E. So an act or mission in or outside Canada. So it's either that is committed, this is the purposes, and then number 2, that intentionally causes substantial property damage, whether to public or private property, or if causing such damage is likely to result in the conduct or harm referred to in any of the clauses A to C, or E, causes serious interference with or serious disruption of an essential service, facility, or system, whether public or private, other than a result of advocacy, protest, dissent, or stoppage from work that is not intended to result in the conduct or harm referred to in any of the clauses A to C. So isn't this kind of like property damage?
Ooh, interesting. So D, no, E, maybe, because I may have misread that. So D is saying if causing such damage is likely
is going to cause A or C. Yeah.
Yeah. But I didn't see the not there, like an idiot.
Yeah, it specifically says not. Yeah, it's something like that.
So for E, yeah, you got me. I apologize. Lefty misinfo.
Debate one. Easy.
I had read D and must have read E and was like, oh, the whole A or C clause must be the same thing from D. No, I'm an idiot. Okay.
All right. Yeah, no worries.
So let's roll.
It's a lot of weird shit to read. Don't worry. All right.
Yeah, no, this is kind of why I hate legal text. Yeah. Okay, so in the sense of essential services, so yeah, eco-terrorism is terrorism now. But if you're doing so to stop essential services, if you're spray painting the gas station, then you're not a terrorist. Okay. There we go.
Good to know. All right.
Yeah. But yeah, so this is kind of how Canada defines terrorism. Now, the big thing here is specifically how the Canadian Criminal Code defines who can face the consequences of terrorism, specifically for the financial services industry, etc. So in the 83.02 to 04, it kind of outlines using property or using resources for terrorism. We won't go over that because it's going to eat up a whole lot of time, but basically it's like, hey, if you know someone's going to be making a weapon, don't give them materials to create the weapon. There you go. And then 83.05 is actually very important, so we'll jump over to that real fast. And this is where we really start to see how the financial services industry kind of comes in to the whole enforcement against terrorism, etc. It gives the
so what
government
document are we in now? Establishment of lists?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Establishment of lists, And then it would be on the next page there, because Canadian Criminal Code is so many pages.
Okay.
This is actually their. It's actually cool that they have this. It's their all their federal laws in one big giant document. Pretty cool, like in regards to criminality, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the governor and council may, by regulation, establish a list on which the governor and council may place any entity if, on the recommendation of the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, the governor and council is satisfied that there are reasonable grounds to believe that A, the entity has knowingly carried out, attempted to carry out, participated in, or facilitated a terrorist activity, or B, the entity has knowingly acted on behalf of, at the direction of, or in association with an entity referred to in paragraph A. So basically what this is saying is you can place a entity, in this case a like business entity, organization, etc., group, anyone that has carried out terrorism or knowingly supported a group doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where it becomes very important for the financial services sector, because it is very hard for private companies to know, man, who is every terrorist in the world?
Yeah,
and
it's pretty
how do we
difficult.
not? Yeah, how do we keep them from having banking services? And luckily, the United States and Canada, as well as I assume most democratic European countries, but I haven't looked into it, publish lists of terrorist organizations, people affiliated with terrorism. And when regulation is written, like a bit later here, in 83.08, which, let's see.
Freezing of property. No person in Canada,
there
no
we go.
Canadian outside Canada shall knowingly.
Exactly. Deal and provide any financial really the big one that is all encompassing is provide any financial or other related services in respect to property referred to in paragraph A for the benefit or at direction of a terrorist group. Basically, terrorist group can't have bank accounts, or if they do, we freeze them. And this is how we know who to freeze, is that there are lists, and these lists are published, and we can go look at those lists. Now, there's one distinction I do want to point out here. In the regulation in the criminal code, is that when they say provide when they're outlining who you are unable to provide services to, it outlines either people on a list or groups on a list or groups not on a list, but there is reasonable belief to believe that they are going to be doing a terrorism.
Okay.
What it does not say is people not on a list, that there is reasonable belief that they are going to be doing a terrorism.
Okay.
And this is an important distinction, and this is a little bit where the U.S. failed, because if you know anything about the TSA, the distinction is if you suspect a group of being a terrorist organization, that means they can't have it like a business account. They can't do business with you as a group. But individuals that may be a part of that group, or you may suspect may be a part of that group, can, so to speak. But luckily, the government is good at identifying those individuals, so they put them on a list. Now, why this is important is because if your name is Muhammad and your bank has a racist banker, the banker could say, actually, we're not allowing you to have a bank account, or we're freezing your assets because your name is Muhammad, and that means you're a terrorist. And this is what that protects against.
Okay.
Is that the personal assets of people suspected, justifiably or not, and many times it's not, of being a terrorist, are protected. but the group assets are liable to seizure, etc.
Okay, so am I misunderstand? Because I've heard that the like individuals associated or who attended the convoy protests are like liable towards having their assets seized.
Yeah, that is why we're saving the emergency economic orders
All right, we're saying that for the
measure
LAC.
for last.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay, gotcha.
because I want to contrast this with existing terrorism legislation and how this goes above. And this is why specific, not the Emergencies Act or the declaration of a public order emergency, but the specific addendum, the Emergency Economic Measures Order, is very dangerous. And in its broadness, its non-specificity, and its lack of direction for the financial industry. So yeah, they'll establish lists. If a person's not on a list, you can't discriminate against the person, but you can discriminate against the group. So there's our criminal code there. And then I have a couple notes on the main document there. It specifies financial targets being suspected organizations or specified, i.e. listed individuals and organizations. And also this legislation grants immunity to civil suits in good faith enforcement. The immunity to civil suits, if you're a bank trying to enforce this legislation, is actually something you'll find in almost all financial legislation.
Yeah, so that like an individual who has like an account and that can't just pursue a civil lawsuit because
exactly.
Kind of like what they do in like a U.S. president, right? It's kind of like a similar thing here, how you can file civil lawsuits against the U.S. president. Yeah,
okay. Like when I know Bosch made a big deal about this, and in a sense, it kind of is a big deal. But if a government is doing its job and making these types of rules very specific, very well outlined, etc., and then this whole no civil suit thing is not that big a deal, because the bank has a very strong belief, if we're not going to open an account for a terrorist organization, that they are a terrorist organization because the government basically told them so. And it's very reasonable for them to make that claim. With how broad this economic measures order is, there's so little direction that same protection against civil suits is going to provide cover for a lot of bad outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. So just to understand what you're saying there is that, hey, so the other terrorist legislation, if you have a racist banker and a client called Mohammed, he can't just unilaterally like freeze that shit and just be like, well, I mean, you had a weird name, like who fucking knows? But then there's also instances in which, hey, you might have like a pretty good idea, or that person might actually be part of like a terrorist organization or whatever, but now you can't do anything about it. But unfortunately, if you allow people to do something about that, then you also open up for like, hey, you open up for the racist banker to do the thing, to Mohammed. So it's kind of like it seems very difficult to thread like a legal fine line through that, allows for one thing but excludes for the other, unless you have then the going through of like court processing on these types of things, which is to use to determine truth. But then it kind of undermines the whole point of an emergency act, because then it's going to be slow and bloated, which is not what you want for an emergency act, right? You need to have swift and direct action. So it's complex to say the least.
And yes, and like kind of like specifically there is the protection against civil liability for the bank. It's to help the bank actually enforce it, essentially, because if a bank's scared that they're going to get sued for $10 million, they're just going to start ignoring regulations. I'll be real with you, banks are very profit driven. But yes. And also with specific transactions, like let's say racist banker, Mohammed, you can't discriminate there. But let's say Mohammed actually tries sending a wire transfer to Afghanistan. That transaction can be blocked. So the key is not discriminating against people opening accounts, but transactions specific or freezing their assets. but specific transactions can still be blocked depending on where they're going. If they're going to a sanctioned country, a person on one of these lists, or a person associated with someone on one of these lists. There's essentially entire departments at banks that, like, for every wire transfer that goes out, they name check. And they're like, okay, where's this going? Who's it going to? Is this person on any bad list? Is it a sanctioned country? Is it a sanctioned government? Is it a sanctioned person, entity, whatever?
Yeah.
So
otherwise known as among streamers as a Control F moment, but yeah.
Yeah, yes. Exactly. We Control F every transaction.
Yeah.
So if Mohammed, we can't stop Mohammed from opening an account because that would be discriminatory, because we do not have a reasonable belief that he is a terrorist or anything like that, except for his name, which is very racist. But if he then takes actions to support these, then not only do we block those, another legislation that we actually won't read because it's very big, very time consuming, is the PCML TFA.
PCNL TFA.
Yeah, and that outlines all the transaction and the reporting of transactions for money laundering and terrorist financing. So if Mohammed starts doing funky transactions, the bank will actually report those to the government. And in certain cases, like if it's going to a sanctioned country, etc., it will actually block that specific transaction. And the key here is this is kind of how people get added to the lists. If we see Mohammed is actually sending money to like Putin, etc., bad organizations, sanctions, those get reported to the government, and then the government can be like, hey, maybe Mohammed is, and then they have some CIA Black Ops guy look into the background of Mohammed, like, okay, where's he from? Who's his friends, etc. And then if they find connections to actual terrorist organizations, then he may be added to the list of individuals. So like the second piece there is the reporting, which is key, is that's how we find out who to put on the list. But until they're on the list, you can't discriminate against individuals on assumptions.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, but then when the emergencies in place, then they have the capacity to do so.
Yes, banks are working only off of assumptions.
And now I have a big question for you then. Is it that they freeze specific transactions, like hey, if there's or is it all their shit?
The Emergency Powers Act, Emergency Economic Measures Act, actually freezes everything.
Okay, is there a reason for why you would want it to freeze everything instead of just the specific transactions?
In this case, no. Like, a little bit, because the idea is, like, let's say a bunch of Nazis in America raise $1 million for their Nazi friends in Canada. And mind you, for the audience, the Canadian protesters are scum of the earth people. Like, this is why I'm not against the Emergency Powers Act being implemented specifically. It's just this economic piece that I'm against, because they are causing widespread disruption, economic damage to the country, etc. But let's say that American Nazis raise money for their Nazi friends in Canada, send it to them via GoFundMe. There is a case where you want to freeze those assets. If you think that, oh,
I guess,
well, this money is going to be used to buy guns for their January 6th moment.
Okay.
But what this order does not do is it does not identify assets based off of what the assets are for, but instead who owns the assets or who are the assets from. So, and which individuals owns the assets, which is a very important distinction, at least in terms of legality. Because what this lays out is it's not just, oh, we can freeze the GoFundMe money from the American Nazis. It's now, we're going to freeze John, the Canadian protester's personal bank account. John has to pay rent next month. Too bad. Frozen. We can seize, and if it progresses for far enough, because freezing is kind of like the first step towards seizure or forfeiture. We can then seize those funds, or what we have in America called civil asset forfeiture. Are you familiar with that?
I believe so. So like if is that kind of a situation in which if you're under investigation for any given thing, you can have a bunch of your assets kind of just like seized for the moment, and then it's kind of iffy on whether or not you can get that back, or am I thinking of the wrong thing?
Yes. In the financial industry, that's actually exactly it. Is when you're under investigation, the government will send like me, the banker, a court order saying, "Hey, freeze this person's assets," and cool. And then they go through their thing with their investigation, all that fun stuff. And then another court order comes a month later, because freezing is like the keep it there, and we'll decide what to do with it. And then a month later, we'll either get a court order saying, "Okay, you can release them," or we're going to seize those assets, and then we hand those assets off to the government.
Okay.
Now, unrelated is another form of civil asset forfeiture that's very, very fucked up in the United States, which is if you are not under investigation, but just suspected of being involved in a crime, really if the property in question is suspected of being involved in any crime or legal activity, it can be seized. And this is most likely a problem with local police departments where, let's say you get pulled over because you were speeding, whatever, doesn't matter. The local cop sees that you have like a wad of $10,000 in your dashboard because you're on your way. This actually happened to a guy, I forget his name. You're on, like there was a whole story written about him, but you're on your way to go buy a car. The officer can then claim you're going to buy drugs. Seize the money.
Just borrow these, yeah.
Yeah. And then the only way for you to get your money back is not to prove that you weren't buying drugs. Like that it's not innocent until proven guilty. It's proving that there's no way your money was going to be used to buy drugs.
Okay. So then you gotta like clear the person you were buying the car from as well, and the whole
Yeah. The assumption of guilt is no longer the assumption is no longer innocence. The assumption is now guilt when we're talking about asset forfeiture. But yeah, that's a bit off topic, but that's another fucky thing we have in America.
I see.
But yeah, let's zoom through this because luckily we're almost done. We're done with all the legal documentation, which honestly, I would not blame the chat if they wanted to jump off a bridge after reading some of that.
I don't know. We're going to do something similarly inducing because I'm going to be playing Get Over It. I don't know if you know what that is, but yeah.
Oh God, no.
Yeah, you know, we
don't
do it.
Do that to yourself.
I gotta do it. Okay. Anyway, yeah, keep going.
Okay. So yeah, scroll down to the second page on our main document there.
Okay.
And we have the MLTFA that I linked. I'm not going to go over it, but it's linked there for your reference. But it also gives that provision to immunity from civil suits, and it establishes the reporting agencies in Canada, FinTrack, which is basically when banks report scary transactions. This is who they report it to. Also, for both Canada and the United States, and I can tell you guys this only because I am not filing a report on you personally. If I were filing a report on you personally, I could get arrested. Because one of the fun things of this legislation is if I tell someone I'm filing a suspicious activity report, then I'm also liable because it's supposed to be secret.
Okay.
But I'll tell you this: any cash transaction in the United States or Canada, either depositing cash, withdrawing cash, purchasing a monetary instrument is a cashier's check, a money order, etc. Over $10,000 is reported to the government. Actually, in America specifically, purchasing a monetary instrument over $3,000 is reported to the government. So that is just for all your information. So if I know a lot of socialists are like, this will be how the government tracks us. Well, if you do a large enough transaction, they already do. And I'll admit that's a little bit scary and a little bit funky, but now you know.
Yeah, okay. I see.
And then we have just some links to the guidance from both FinTrack, who handles the reporting of transactions, And then the OSFI is kind of Canada's agency that handles auditing banks. And their guidance is more so on monitoring who is a customer. Like, are you checking the terrorist lists? Where FinTrack is the transaction specific. And then here comes our very useful bit, is the list of sanctions. We don't have to go into them. If you want, you can open a couple just to show chat what they look like. Basically, this is Government of Canada's list of every known terrorist agent, organization, individual, etc., as well as sanctions. And this is kind of what banks go off of when, under existing money laundering terrorism legislation, we say, hey, no, you're not allowed to open an account. And it's because you're on one of these lists. And now I'll contrast it with the Emergency Economic Measures Order. And this is where things get a little bit funky. So I have that second document there for you that I sent over. And this one is basically the text of the order, but highlighted in certain bits. And this is where the Emergency Economic Measures Order broadens the existing concepts from our anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism financing legislation to very dangerous degrees. So we have, up at the top, we have all this preamble. Ignore that, it's all the normal, this is a bill type stuff.
Okay.
And then we have definitions. Our important definition here is a designated person. It means any individual or entity that is engaged directly or indirectly in an activity prohibited by sections 2 to 5 of the Emergency Measure Regulations. Those are the measures saying if you enter the location where a protest is happening, with a couple of exceptions, like if you live there or something, then you're in violation. If you travel through it without good reason, you're in violation. If you do anything to facilitate the protest, you're in violation. If you provide any, I believe one of like the legal terms is like comfort, as in assistance or a place to stay or food or whatever to the protesters themselves, then you're in violation. And this is just kind of outlining what the emergency order is saying. Don't do this. You might get arrested. You might get charged, etc. But our designated person is anyone doing any of those things. Now, this is different because in money laundering terrorism legislation, the target, so to speak, of those financial actions is usually very well defined. It is they are either on a list published by the government, or we have very good reason to believe that a group, not an individual, a group is somehow engaged in terrorist activity. And our definition of terrorism is much more narrow than our definition of people that are in violation of sections 2 to 5 of the Emergency Act. Because sections 2 to 5 basically say, if you're there without living there, you could be in violation. If you're there just protesting and you're not even doing anything illegal, like there's the assholes blocking the road, all that jazz, and you're over on like the corner waving a flag, what have you, you're in violation. Yeah, you're included in there. This isn't specified down to who is causing the economic harm or who is causing violence or threats. This is specified to basically everybody involved in one way or another. This includes, let's say, you're a radical centrist, and you have a cousin from out of town. You live in Ottawa. You have a cousin from out of town who's coming to do the protest, and he stays at your house while this is happening. And you don't agree with it, but he's your cousin, and it's not like it's that bad because you're a radical centrist after all. You're in violation. That if you're the sister of one of the protesters, and I saw a lot of the protesters are complaining about restaurants not serving them, and you're like, oh, well, my brother's hungry, blah, and you like drive over there and like drop off some food for them, you're in violation. Yeah. this broadness of who a designated person is so wide.
Mm-hmm.
It is pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, I should claim the brother, the cousin, and the sister there, they are not designated people, but they're covered under this Section 2 bit here because they're assisting or doing something for the benefit of a designated person.
Okay, and in that case, you have the same opportunities for your stuff to get seized as a designated person, pretty much. Okay, so you're basically a designated person, yeah.
Yeah, essentially, but you don't get to have the term.
Okay, I see.
So, duty to cease any dealings. This is the basically freeze the assets. So, dealing any property wherever situated. That one's only in some terrorism legislation, which is why it's highlighted. Basically, that means if it the Bank of British Columbia, for instance, has a lot of American branches, and they have American bank accounts. Or it's like, there's one of the freaking Canadian banks. I always get checks from them.
Okay.
If you have an American bank account in America with a Canadian bank, then that is covered under wherever situated. Some legislation does not cover that though. But that's just to show international funds, etc., are also covered by this. And then we have indirectly, and then by a designated person, and then this is where we get the cousin and the sister being included, or by a person acting on behalf of or at the direction of that designated person. Making available any property, including funds or virtual currency to or for the benefit of designated person or to a person acting on behalf of or at the direction of a designated person. So essentially, if the sister is going to buy groceries so she can even drop off the food, this is covered because it's going to be under the behalf of a designated person. And her accounts could be frozen. Whether she agrees with the protest or not, whether she's an anti-vaxxer, whatever or not, maybe she just has some family loyalty, even though her family's batshit crazy. She could be hit by this.
Okay.
And then the following entities must determine on a continuing basis that they are in possession or control of property that's owned, held, or controlled, or on behalf of a designated person. So this just lists all the different types of money services businesses. You don't have to go through it. It's basically banks, check cashers, blah. But once again, it includes our behalf of a designated person, and also the duty to determine is a thing in existing terrorism and money laundering legislation. But here's the difference: is the duty to determine is fulfilled by cross-referencing your existing customers against those lists of sanctioned or terrorist entities. The government does not have a list of designated people, and is kind of leaving the onus on the banks to figure out if someone is a designated person. And this is where it kind of gets dangerous because first it's broad, it's widely applying, and yeah. And then registration requirement, FinTrack. This one's kind of fun that I'm actually happy about. They should have done this a while ago. It basically makes it so crowdfunding platforms and cryptocurrency platforms now have to register as money services businesses, which they didn't have to before. Really, every country should pass this to get those organizations in line with other financial entities regulations. And then reporting obligations, suspicious transaction. This is basic, pulled right from the PCMLFA. I hate that acronym.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's basically saying, hey, if you think this transaction is sketchy, report it. If it's over this amount, report it. If you have reason to believe it's doing these things, terrorism, money laundering, report it. And then here's our one other spicy bit. Is every entity set out under Section 3, meaning all financial institutions, must disclose without delay to the Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police blah, 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 the Canadian CIA, I guess. The existence of property and any information about a transaction. The information, so essentially what this is saying is if someone is suspected to be a designated person, like the bank has a reason, any reason to believe that you are a designated person or that this property is held on behalf of a designated person, like the GoFundMe situation went to the cousin's bank account or something, then all of that property record and all transactions related to that property record gets passed up to the government. So what that means is Bobby Joe is our protester. If the bank believes Bobby Joe is a designated person, first they're going to freeze all his assets. Then they're going to pass up to Canadian CIA all financial history, all financial transactions. I don't know how far the financial history will go back because it kind of depends on how they're defining the property. Like, are we tracking it by dollar or tracking it by all his property he's ever had? Like this last month's paycheck from that he's already spent, but it was before he was a designated person count. Who knows? But it's a little bit dangerous. It's not as dangerous as the other stuff, but just because it's a wide berth of information that's being passed up to the government, and it's a lot of information. So it's just like one of those like kind of orange flags, so to speak.
When it comes to privacy concerns and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, we have the immunity. No proceedings under the Emergencies Act will hit any bank complying with the order. Now, the one good thing here is a Government of Canada provincial or territorial institution may disclose information to any entity set out in Section 3 that the disclosing institution is satisfied that the disclosure will contribute to the application of this order. Now, what this means is that the Canadian CIA could come to me, the banker, and be like, hey, we have evidence that Bobby Joe is a designated person. And they give me the evidence. And mind you, that's still without a court order, but it's a little bit better.
Okay, yeah.
It's a bit better because I am going to trust the Canadian authorities way more than the suspicions of a private institution and how broadly this gets applied. So it's not perfect. It's not a court order, but it's something.
Okay.
But the kind of the key here is that it says that they may provide it. They don't have to provide it. Okay. Meaning the onus is on the bank to still identify designated people. But sometimes you may get lucky and just have the government identify a designation for designated person for you, and you don't have to do the work. Now, that's kind of like outlining where this gets spicy. And I'd say I just want to take like a couple more minutes of your time. I'm realizing we're coming up on like 45. I lied to you. I'm sorry.
We're coming up on, it's probably been an hour, I think, but that's all right.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Damn it. I'm sorry.
No worries, it's all good.
This is like my big concern, because widely this violates civil liberties in a few different ways with its broad application, its lack of clarity on who this applies to, etc. That this can be abused if the government so chooses to. I'm not saying they will, but this is kind of like the dangerous things with laws. If you are not specific enough, if you leave things very broad, then it gives room for governments to invade on civil liberties that you would assume would be protected. Like in America, we currently have a rash of education control with CRT and all that. And the legislation being passed in Republican states is very broad. And it basically gives a lot of them merit to cut down anything that really discusses racism, whether it's exactly CRT or not, which almost none of it is. But so that's dangerous. All that is a dangerous in and of itself. But what I personally think may have the biggest societal concerns is leaving the onus on the banks to decide this.
Mm-hmm.
Because banks, with this type of stuff, if there's no profit incentive for them to not do it, I mean, I'll be honest, banks will be risky as hell if they think they can make a lot of money doing it. But if there's no profit incentive and there's possible violations with this there are, then they will just be very, very scared, very, very cautious of anyone they even have an inkling of a suspicion that may be possibly their designated person. And banks broadly will just, if they have any reason to believe you're a designated person, like if you, this could extend, I'm not saying it will or is even likely to happen, this could extend to if a banker sees on your Facebook profile that you think it's weird the government wants you to take all these vaccines, and that's the only thing. It's not like Nazi propaganda, it's nothing like that. They may just hit you with this hammer, and they'll be protected because they're trying to apply the regulation in good faith. But because the government hasn't defined the boundaries of what is good faith application, their protection is very broad. And there are a couple of examples that I do want to touch on real quick in the United States specifically, of banks being left with the deciding factor, like, oh, well, who are we allowed to bank with, etc., and the societal harms. The first is unbanked people. Are you familiar with this term?
I assume somebody who is an affiliate with a bank?
Yeah. Essentially, these are people that have no traditional bank account, traditional financial services, and they only contribute, interact with financial system through alternative means. So that means they don't have a bank account or debit card or anything like that. But what they do is they take their paycheck to a check casher, which those places are very predatory, and cash their check and get cash and do everything in cash. It limits their ability to interact with society a lot, and more every single year. Like a couple of years ago, there was a big thing in San Francisco where shops were being trendy by not taking cash, only taking debit cards or mobile payments.
By the way, that might be like a not trendy thing in the US. That's almost standard practice here in the Nordics, actually.
Yes.
So,
yeah. Although, to be fair, the Nordics don't have the same unbanked problem that Canada and the US do.
Probably true.
Because the spicy bit of that is that roughly 8% of the American population is unbanked, of the adult population.
Okay. Well.
Meaning about 1 in 11 people does not have a traditional bank account. Specifically, lower class, immigrants, minorities. Due to troubles getting an ID, the legality of their presence in the country, and being scared to even go to a bank because they think they might get reported to ICE, etc. And so when you have things like what happened in San Francisco, it's kind of like cutting out, oh, you can't shop at this grocery store because reasons. And being unbanked causes a lot of other issues with credit scores, etc. Because you don't have a credit score, and because you don't have a credit score, you can't get an apartment by yourself, or at least in a traditional way, because they don't have any credit to check. So you live with friends, you have trouble finding housing, or you're going through some weird alternative landlord, like the guy that owns just 3 houses, and that's his whole rental scheme. So he doesn't even use credit reports. And those places are kind of rife with tenant abuse. And basically, you fall into a lot of abusive systems when you're unbanked, and you don't have a positive connection to the banking industry. Now, I touched a little bit on the undocumented status causing this, but a couple other things to touch on this that cause this issue is the Patriot Act, which is very similar to Canada's terrorism code. So this is kind of connected tangentially to our economic measures order. The Patriot Act defines, and so does Canada's new financial regulations passed around the same time based on the Patriot Act, what you need to open a bank account for someone. Prior to 9/11, it was the procedure was know your customer, and it's basically like, I know Bob, and I trust that that's Bob.
Okay, I see.
In some banks have more stringent stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but there's not a whole lot of legal requirement of what documentation you need to prove identity, etc.
Okay.
The Patriot Act changed that, and now we need standardized government ID, like a driver's license, passport, something, picture ID with expiration, which is a problem for some people. Some people of minorities, like I just got I just had to renew my license here in Washington. It cost like $55.
Mm-hmm.
To someone working minimum wage in the South, whatever, $55 is like 2 weeks of groceries.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you have a whole, that ties into voter ID, why there's a lot of minority individuals that have trouble getting an ID. But because they have trouble getting an ID, they also have trouble getting bank accounts. So that's one aspect. One of the other things the Patriot Act stipulates is that we need a physical address for every person.
Which is
now,
for homeless people then. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. You got it. Physical means an actual physical place.
Mm-hmm.
And banks look at that and they're like, okay, you don't have an address, you can't have a bank account. And so homeless people specifically, or people with unstable living situations, are incredibly unbanked.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I haven't seen research on proportions, but I would say the majority, if not an overwhelming majority. And so aside from having trouble getting housing, they're now completely divorced from the financial system. And a lot of that is just caused by that little address clause, because banks don't want, they're like, nope, no physical address, you're out. And even though the government later came in and said, well, if you want, you can use this as a physical address, and it's like you have to put the street, like cross-section of where they like to camp.
Okay.
And most banks hated that, so they're like, yeah, we're not doing that.
I see, yeah.
Because and the other one is going to be marijuana legislation.
Okay.
Of examples of where banks were left with the whole, you get to decide. So I'm in Washington, and I was previously in Oregon, 2 states in the U.S. that passed marijuana legalization relatively quickly. And if anyone in the audience is anything familiar with the marijuana industry, you would know it is impossible to get bank accounts. It's getting easier now with certain credit unions and marijuana-specific banks. But for many years, it was like you keep a vault in your basement, and every night you run cash from your business to your house and hope nobody realizes that there's $700,000 in your basement, which is very dangerous. And the cause for this was no bank, no federally regulated bank or credit union would open accounts for businesses that engage in marijuana, for fear that because it wasn't federally legal, that the federal government would come get them. And there's a few other implications with marijuana, but I'll leave that off because I've eaten so much of your time.
Okay, I have one final question then about the Emergency Measures Act. So does this mean that from this point forward, further transactions will fall under this, or can previous transactions made towards the convoy protest also be implicated for this, or how does that work?
Ooh, that is a good question. I believe this is retroactive. Since, let's jump back there. Since the measure basically says, hey, if you're a designated person, we're going to give your financial history to the government, then previous transactions would fall under it. To be clear, though, since the transactions happened already, it's possible that there's no way for them to freeze those assets. Like, let's say, hey, I'm Bobby Joe, the protester, and 3 months ago, I paid my friend to buy a truck. The government can't then go to Bobby Joe's friend and freeze the assets from 3 months ago, because it wasn't for the benefit of Bobby Joe while he was a designated person.
Yeah, but if that would have happened like at the beginning, like on the 24th or whatever, then it would be a different thing.
Yeah, I believe then it would be a different thing.
Okay.
But that transaction history itself from 3 months ago would still be reported. So even though you sold your friend your truck, and maybe you're not comfortable with the government knowing that, they know that. But I do not believe that this will cause freezes. Now, everything I've said so far comes with one caveat. It's that a lot of this is going to come down to how the financial sector of the Canadian government directs banks to do this. Because basically, when these things get passed, the OFSI in Canada and the finance minister, I think is their title, will be in communication with banks like, here's how we want this implemented, here's what we want this to look like, etc. And right now, there's no clear information on what that is, on what is being communicated between them, and that information may never be made public. Parts of it may be made public, etc. So it's possible that when the government goes to the banks, they're already in talks with the banks, but when they go and talk to the banks, they're going to say, hey, we know this is really broad, but actually only do this because everything else is really evil and sketchy. Then that is a thing that could happen.
And that brings me back to, I think, which was my conclusion before as well. It seems like the Emergency Act, you need to have different degrees of an Emergency Act, because it seems like it's either like you get to do all this crazy shit or you get nothing. So you definitely, because there are many points on the Emergency Act that are way more like, I suppose, like close to the current paradigm of how stuff operates compared to like a lot of the stuff that we've discussed here. So I think you absolutely need degrees, and then you also don't have to like trust, the financial arm of the government to do things in a specific way. Then you know that, okay, they've been given this degree of Emergency Act clearance, therefore they cannot do more than this or whatever. So for sure, so you don't have to just trust the word of like a government official or whatever. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah, kind of like the thing here is the legislation itself is very broad and allows for a lot of things. And that's where we get into bad territory. Whether the government will actually ask the banks to do those bad things is a different question. But it allows for those things, which is dangerous.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you have any final questions at all after I've eaten so much of your time?
I think that was mostly it. Yeah, thank you very much for your knowledge on this and going through this dry as legal code.
Yeah, definitely. And feel free to look at some of the other documents linked there, especially the law firms' opinions on the matter. They're very interesting. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on, and I'm glad I was able to kind of get some info out there to y'all.
Yeah, it was great. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Bye-bye.